Bonsoir, Monsieur le Ministre, dear Jean-Noël. So I'm very pleased to welcome you at the School of Public Affairs for this masterclass. And I'm very pleased that you accepted to discuss the digital agenda with our students. In a sense, I'm not very surprised you accepted our invitation because there are 4 good reasons to accept our invitation. You're obviously the best placed to discuss this issue as the Minister in charge of digital affairs. Second is that you're here at home in the sense that you're a professor of the university and in front of international students. A third reason is that you're a friend of the School of Public Affairs. You're part of the committee, the strategic committee of the School of Public Affairs. And fourth, we're friends. So there are 4 good reasons for you to accept. Still, I'm super thankful for that you accepted our invitation. So the master's class is going to blend 2 dimensions, the European dimension and the digital dimension. And in fact, there are students coming from 2 policy streams here, European, the Master in European Affairs and Digital Affairs. So we're going to blend these two dimensions. Last point is that I'm also very pleased to welcome and introduce Valérie Peugeot, who is going to moderate the discussion with the students. And Valérie is the new scientific advisor for this policy stream on digital affairs and public policy. So thank you again, Jean-Noël. And Valérie, the floor is yours for a short introduction.
It will be very, very short as we run late. So, dear Mr. Barrot, Mr. Minister, I would like also to thank you really warmly for being with us tonight. Just to introduce who is in front of you, all the students here are a member of the School of Public Affairs. Some are specialized in public policies, those European affairs, and we have a group of students, those who are sitting in front of you, who have taken a specialization in digital issues. And they will be interacting with you when we'll have question and answers later on. So I had a little introduction that I will skip, and I just give you the floor straight away. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Philippe. Thank you, Valérie. Thank you, all of you, for being here and inviting me. Sorry for being late. I'm very happy to discuss with you topics around the EU digital agenda and how France looks at it. For a long time, in the digital area, as in other areas, what has happened in Europe is that there was a single principle that was enormously frustrating. This single principle was the country of origin principle. Sorry to start with this technical thing, but I'm sure you're technical people. But it's very important to understand that. It was set by the e-commerce directive of 2000. And it basically says that any member state that would like to impose some rules on services that are provided by a company that is established in another member state cannot do so unless the country where the company is located also imposes the same rules. This has generated enormous frustration. Why? Because this has led to regulatory dumping. You remember this. You remember fiscal dumping with a number of companies locating in Ireland, locating in Luxembourg to benefit from better fiscal conditions. As you probably know, we've just put an end to that with a minimum corporate income tax of 15% that is actually going to be implemented in French fiscal law, as you know, the budget law was presented this morning by my boss, the Ministry of Economics and Finance. So everybody has in mind the fiscal dumping. Fewer have in mind the regulatory dumping, which led a number of big tech companies to establish presence in countries where, you know, the regulation was likely to be softer, like Ireland, for instance. And then enormous democratic frustration, because we use those services in our daily lives. We complain every day about their monopolistic nature, about the fact that social networks bear no responsibilities, and so on and so forth. But we have no say because these guys are located outside of France, and therefore we cannot impose certain rules on them based on the country of origin principles. And we just put an end to this for a wide array of services after 5 years of hard work and the political impulse of France. We've put an end to this principle by establishing common rules in a number of digital domains. And this is great because we're finally going to be, or we have finally succeeded in setting, demanding rules that big tech need to abide by. Okay, and I'm going to give you examples, but I wanted to start with this idea that for 20 years people have been super frustrated in France, in particular, about the fact that they could not do anything about big tech. And that thanks to the current Commission, the current Parliament, and thanks to France in particular, that chaired the EU last year, we've been able to pass a number of regulations that unify the digital market in a number of areas, and therefore raises the level of rules that big tech have to comply with. I'm not saying that France was successful in raising the bar as high as we would have liked. But obviously, the bar is now much higher than it used to be when they were all settled in Ireland with a bar that was relatively low. Let me give you 2 examples of how we've been able, at the European level, thanks to France's and President Macron's commitment to make things change, and how we've been able to impose a higher bar. One is about fair competition. One thing that everybody complained about was that big tech have or implement sort of unfair commercial practices to establish their domination on certain markets. Let me give you 2 examples. One is that when you buy your iPhone or your Google phone, you're going to have a browser, a personal assistant that is going to be pre-installed. So good luck if you're the developer of a European browser or a European personal assistant, when any EU citizen that buys an iPhone or a Google phone has these things already pre-installed. It's impossible. Another example is self-preference. The most commonly used browser tends to show when you, or not the browser, the search engine. The most commonly used search engine tends to favor, when you look for a video, for instance, videos that come out of their their other companies, or the companies that they are linked to. I hope you're following me. The most well-known browser starts with a G and has a video service that is linked through the same corporate group that starts with a Y. But when you're the French video platform that starts with a D, then people have to scroll down to the last pages of the search before they find the same video coming from a company that is not linked to the search engines company. This is self-preference. I'm going to move up results from my own companies and move down results from competing companies. So these are practices that were already illegal in Europe. But the thing is that the way they were treated is that competition authorities would investigate those matters. It would take years, and then years down the road, competition authorities would sanction the companies. But the European companies that were trying to compete and that sued in the first place were already dead a couple of years down the road. And so what we did is set up an act a European legislation that's called the Digital Markets Act that lists 26 unfair commercial practices, and that says these were already illegal, but now we won't wait for competition authorities to investigate and see whether or not those practices happen. We're going to forbid those 26 practices ex ante. And this is going to make a huge difference. And so next year, if we convene again, then those of you who will have bought or recently bought a smartphone will have had the choice of their browser, of their search engine, of their personal assistant. Those of you who value the French video service that starts with a D will not have to scroll down for pages and pages before they find the video. You will be able to chat with your friends that use a messaging service that starts with a W without having to download this messaging service. So let me say it in maybe for those that have already lost. You will be able to communicate with people that are on WhatsApp without having to download WhatsApp. And the list goes on for 24 other practices that used to be implemented by those big tech to establish domination on those markets, and that will now be forbidden. And of course, there are sanctions associated to violation of these new rules. And the EU Commission will be able to charge up to 10% of global turnover or global sales in fines the first time around, and 20% of global sales in case a digital company breaches those new regulations for a second time around. So that's a very important thing. And even for those of you who are studying or are going to study competition law, this is a revolution. It's the first time in history that competition is going to be enforced ex ante rather than ex post through investigations by competition authorities. The only domain where there was competition policy applying ex ante was the control of merger and acquisitions. But that was the only case where competition authorities would look at things before they happen. Now, the EU Commission will look at things before they happen. So one frustration that goes away. Another frustration, and the reason why I'm late is because I was the Prime Minister detailing our plan against cyberbullying and bullying in schools. One thing that was super frustrating over the past 20 years is that we've seen those big platforms take no responsibilities for the contents that were stored on their services. And the reason for that is that we set up the rules this way. Okay? We assumed at the beginning of the internet that when there were going to be platforms, the platforms had nothing to do with the legal or illegal nature of messages that were sent through those platforms or products that were sold through those platforms. It was the responsibility of the person who sends the message or the person who sells the illegal product. But of course, 20 years later, this does not hold any longer. Everyone here knows that TikTok, Facebook, Instagram play a role in the way we see the messages. And everyone assumes that Amazon should have a responsibility when there are illegal products that are sold on the platforms. And so there was huge frustration because all those companies are located in a country that was not bothered by these questions. Okay? And so here again, the Commission, the Parliament, and France pushed very hard to take another piece of legislation, the Digital Services Act, that completely changes the situation. And that creates new obligations that have come into place on 25th of August of this year for these big platforms. They are not going to be considered as traditional media editors. You know, a media editor has a director of the publication, and if there is something illegal coming out of the publication, the the director of the publication can be held legally responsible. So we're not going as far as that. But what we're saying is that those platforms, they have to have in place signaling processes so that users can easily signal something that they see and that is illicit. They have to moderate these contents. When they see illegal content, they need to signal it to local authorities. They'll have to share their data with researchers. They'll have to audit their algorithms. They'll have to provide an algorithm that is not based on your personal data, and this is actually already in place. If you look at LinkedIn, if you look at Instagram, if you look at TikTok, you can now choose an algorithm that is going to push content to you that is not based on your personal data. But most importantly, and here lies the revolution associated with this Digital Service Act, they will have to analyze and correct the systemic risk that their services cause on people's health. And here we think, obviously, of the case of youth and children and early exposure to social networks and inappropriate content. The harm they cause on information, and therefore the fight that or the actions that they need to take to avoid disinformation on their platform, and the harm that they can cause on public safety. And here again, I was mentioning earlier sort of the revolution in terms of competition policy that is implemented by this EU regulation. Here, it is a revolution in terms of the liability of those big platforms, but because it will not be only about illegal messages. It will be about how the service in itself can cause harm to public health, to public security, or to public speech. Now, of course, it will be up to the EU Commission to investigate whether or not the platforms comply with these new rules. The EU Commission will have the power to charge fines up to 6% of global sales. That's 300 million euros for Twitter, 600 million euros for TikTok. And if those platforms breach the rules once again, the Commission, it's a tricky procedure, but the Commission has more or less the right to ban those platforms from the EU. So that's another important dimension of what Europe and France have achieved over the past 5 years. I'm not going to go any longer. I'm sure we'll talk about AI and stuff, but I wanted to mention those two pieces of legislation. I would like to finish with one word. I said earlier that if France pushed so hard for these two legislations to emerge, it was to put an end to this democratic frustration caused by the country of origin principle. But there is also another reason, which is a more positive reason, why it's important to take such regulations in Europe. It's not only to deal with big tech that are not, that in their huge majority not Europeans. It's also to provide our own digital companies with a single digital market. Because the way we look at regulation, at least in France, the current government and the current president, is not a way to mitigate risk or to overprotect our citizens. We believe that innovation goes hand in hand with regulation because innovation cannot happen in small, fragmented national markets. Innovation can only happen when the European market is unified. And when we take those regulations on competition, on social platforms, and maybe we'll talk about what we're doing now on AI, we're also setting a unified playground for European startups. And that's the best thing we can do to help them grow and then compete with the big tech giants coming from outside the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So I will ask the students here to start with their questions. I think they have prepared quite a lot of questions, so there are many of them. So please, go ahead.
Thank you very much for everything you've said. It was indeed very interesting. So my first question is going to be about the Digital Markets Act. And when deliberating on this, American politicians and American experts were very dissatisfied that this piece of legislation actually targets only non-European countries, and they accused this of having a protectionist bias. So my question is, do you think we'll see more transatlantic clashes in regulating digital affairs, and how the elections in the US and in the European Parliament might affect this policy domain?
Well, the American elections will have no effect on the DMA. We are the largest market in the world. We are the largest Western democracy. We don't take orders from the US. Now, it's true that there is a threshold above which digital companies are going to be subject to the Digital Markets Act. And hopefully, someday, I mean, there is at least Zalando. Zalando is a European company that is subject to?
No, it's not.
To the DSA?
To the DSA.
So far, no European company is subject to the DMA, but hopefully it will come. Now, it's interesting that you would say that, you know, this thing with protectionism. Because, of course, on the European scene, French political leaders are seen, whether, you know, whichever is their political background, as super protectionist. Sometimes we make propositions and we fail to convince other member states who are not on the same line as we are, who have different relationships than we have with non-European countries and superpowers. But what's very interesting with the DMA and with the Data Act, which is a regulation that is now being discussed and that applies the same principle of ex-ante enforcement of competition in the cloud sector that is hugely concentrated in the hands of three major players, is that member states in Europe are a lot of member states are always very suspicious when it comes to protectionism, and I respect that, of course. But when you tell them it's not about protectionism, it's about competition, then everyone agrees. Because competition is deeply rooted in the DNA of the European Union. The founding act of the EU, the European Community for Steel and Coal, was basically based on a level playing field for German and French companies. So at the very root of the EU is fair competition. And so when you bring competition to the table, you find consensus across member states, even those that are typically very hostile to any sort of protectionist measure.
Mr. Minister, thank you for coming. I think a lot of what you said touches on my question, but you mentioned notably how the EU is looking to tackle the topic of competition, about self-preference, about, you know, basically helping European businesses compete with American ones or ones from other parts of the world. My question for you is, I wonder if that approach that is very regulation-led is the right approach to create a strong European tech ecosystem. I mean, I look at Europe, we have potentially good companies, we have a lot of startups. You know, you mentioned Dailymotion, they came around at the same time as YouTube. There is European tech talent, but I wonder if this tendency of policymakers, such as yourself, to maybe focus on regulation before putting in place the right conditions for, you know, increased financing or enabling companies to just grow in the same path or same way that American companies do. If that's the best way to move forward, considering, you know, how Europe has fallen behind on that topic and how, you know, these regulatory answers that you're providing on some level are responding to trends that are being imposed on them by American companies. Shouldn't Europe be the one imposing its companies on other regions?
So it's a very valid question. And in fact, when we regulate with the DMA and the DSA, we're doing this in a defensive mode rather than an offensive mode because we don't own the technology. So it really depends, on what topic you're going to ask your question. Ask me about AI. I will tell you that our priority is to own the technology. And by the way, there was two very important announcements today about AI and France. One is the acquisition of major computing resources by a French company, and the second one was the release of a French-grown model, large language model, that is better than any of its peers. So if you ask me about AI, I will tell you that privacy, property right, extreme risk, disinformation, and so on, all this I don't want to care about until I own the technology, because I want to regulate in an offensive position. When I own the technology, I set the standard. If I don't own the technology, I'm going to be subject to the standard that's going to be imposed, just like you said, by giants, and I'm going to regulate, like a loser, basically. Now, in terms of, so that's the first answer to your question. The second answer is, again, innovation and regulation go or can go hand in hand in Europe. Because startups in Europe, when you ask them, why don't you grow as fast as, the US? So they will say, the classic stuff, the money and so on. But a lot of them will tell you, I have to leave to the US or to other regions of the world because I started in France, and expanding in the rest of Europe is horrible because there are legislations that are very different in one country, in every country. And so I'm not saying that unifying the digital market will be enough, but we should unify all markets. But unifying digital markets for digital companies or digitally oriented companies is a way to stimulate innovation, and and that's counterintuitive because often one sees regulation as detrimental to innovation, but I believe, and we've seen that very clearly for crypto assets, for instance. Crypto assets, they were not regulated in the US, but in Europe, we adopted a legislation. So crypto assets are not very popular these days, but still, 5 years ago, France, and I was the rapporteur of this legislation, France decided to create a legislation for platforms, crypto assets platforms. And we tried at the time to strike the right balance between enough flexibility to facilitate innovation, make France a sweet spot for those who want to develop such activities, but also enough protections against addictions, against exposure of minors, against money laundering, terrorist financing, and so on. And it turns out we struck the right balance because Europe, the EU, based their unified regulation on our regulation. But I don't want to talk about France. I want to talk about the EU. When the FTX scandal happened last year, some of you remember, it was a big scandal involving crypto assets. Everybody panicked in the US. And because in Europe we had a unified framework, a large number of leading players in the field, they moved significant chunks of their operations in Europe, in particular in France, because France had been at the origin of this European framework. And so when you create, through regulation, a unified framework, you become a more attractive market. And the third answer to your question about competition. So here again, there is a little bit of a tension. In France, politicians, they typically say, I'm tired with this competition policy in Europe that does not allow us to have big mergers, to have big players, and so on. Okay? Well, the academic research is not going to confirm such an insight. Competition can in many ways be favorable to innovation, can lower prices but also stimulate innovation. But people in France, you'll have a hard time to convince them that the Brussels competition policy is good. Until now. Why? Because when competition policy is not turned against French players but turned against the big tech, then it becomes a way to open up markets, I'm thinking about the cloud market, that are completely closed to new players, newcomers. Why? Because cloud companies, They will heavily subsidize a new customer. They will a new customer firm. They will prevent the customer firm from having several cloud providers. And when the customer firm wants to change cloud provider, they will charge enormous fees. So of course, there are three dominant players in the field, and it's almost impossible in Europe for a French or European company to enter in this market. So when we are going to apply competition policy ex ante, when we are going to forbid the fines that they charge when you want to switch to another provider, when we are going to impose that there is interoperability, that you as a firm can have several providers, and when we are going to regulate those heavy subsidies that they provide to their customer firms, is going to open up the market for French and European players.
As you have already mentioned the AI and the AI Act, I would like to ask if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and what do you see as the major priorities that the EU should focus in the future in terms of digital policies, and do you have any specific policies, digital policies in mind that France would like to promote on an EU level?
For sure. So the AI Act, another example of how regulation can stimulate innovation and investment, which again is kind of counterintuitive. You've probably heard, like, I'm no AI specialist, of course, but you've probably heard, like me, a number of debates about autonomous vehicles. And the fact that at some point it was becoming very tricky, because when the autonomous vehicle, the autonomous car shoots a person walking in the street, who's going to pay? Who's going to be responsible? And this is a very tricky question to solve. And until it is solved, it generates huge uncertainty for those who want to innovate in the field. Am I really going to invest and innovate in this field if there is huge uncertainty about the liabilities in case things turn wrong? And it's true for autonomous cars. It's true for those who develop medical devices based on AI and stuff like that. It's true for a number of activities. And so here what the regulator can do is clarify the liabilities. And by clarifying the liabilities, then you dispel the uncertainty and you generate interest for innovation and investment. And that's the initial purpose of the AI Act. The AI Act says one simple thing: we should regulate, or we should impose some audits and disclosure requirements on the developers of AI systems, depending on what are the use cases of those AI systems, depending on what those AI systems will be used for. And so the AI Act is just a list of use cases for which AI systems are forbidden. Social scoring, global surveillance, and so on. Then a list of activities that are considered as high-risk use cases for which the incorporation of AI systems is subject to relatively substantial audits and transparency requirements. Examples is mobility or health, because of course there are human lives at stake. And so if you want the liabilities to be well established, the person who develops the AI model that is then purchased by that is then included in the manufacturing of the car that eventually shoots the person walking in the street should audit and be transparent about its AI system so that the liabilities can be split. And then there are less risky or no risk use cases, such as leisure, video games, and so on, for which the developers of the AI systems that are associated with these things are not subject to any sort of disclosure or transparency requirements. And France pushed a lot for to keep this thing technology neutral, risk-based. It really depends on the risk downstream. And France also pushed so that we have sandboxes, namely for young companies, small companies, the ability to develop AI systems, AI models, without having to do the audit and disclosure part too soon. Otherwise, it's too heavy to bear for a startup company. Perfect. So the Commission, the EU Commission, published its legislation. The Council, so the governments, they basically agreed with most of what was inside. And in December of last year, we voted, I was there, we voted on a general approach, meaning the position of the Council was relatively close to the position of the Commission. And then the legislation went to the Parliament, to the EU Parliament. And it arrived on the desk of MPs at the same time when something else arrived on the same desk of the same MPs, and this something else is called ChatGPT. And so those MPs, they had exactly the same reaction as I would have had as an MP, which is, this thing is super risky, it's completely crazy, we need to regulate as fast as we can. Oh, and we have an AI Act that's coming to Parliament. Well, let's regulate it using the AI Act. And so what did the EU, the MPs do? They said, so we have this thing that is technology neutral, that is really based on the risk of the use case for which AI is used, whichever category of AI model is used. It doesn't really depend. And they said, let's impose on the developers of large language models, of foundational models, of generative AI models, the same heavy disclosure and audit requirements that the Act imposes on AI system developers when they are used for high-risk use cases. So if you develop a generative AI model for video games, I don't care, I'm still going to impose on you the disclosure and transparency requirements. And I disagree with that. And we disagree with that. And we are going to push as hard as we can for this addition to the AI Act coming from the Parliament to get out of this legislation. Why? Well, for the reason I mentioned earlier. My first reaction when I saw ChatGPT was to say this is very risky, very crazy, and so on. But if we want to regulate smartly generative AI, we need to own generative AI. So anything that comes in the way of France and Europe owning this technology, I will do everything I can to get it out of the way. And there is now a piece of this legislation that is now in the hands of the trilogues, the negotiation between the Council, the EU Parliament, and the EU Commission. And the only thing that I will say when we next meet is that I want this piece of the legislation gotten rid of. And we'll go back to regulation when we own the technology.
If I may ask, can you elaborate a little bit on what you mean when you say we have to own the technology? How are you going to own the generative AI?
Well, France is very well positioned to be a leading country in the generative AI revolution. For one main reason, there are other reasons, but for one main reason is that we have the greatest talents in the field. Most of the leaders in the labs, including of big tech companies, on the AI labs of the largest big tech companies, are French. And what we've seen over the past couple of months is that these French people that were trained in our top universities, but that were then hired by the big tech companies, these people are leaving the big tech AI labs to create their companies in France. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we had two major news this week, because I think one was today, the other one was yesterday. And this is very, very promising. We also have even more promising signals, one of which is that the founder of GitHub is the library of code that any developer in the world uses. Well, the founder of GitHub is creating its own generative AI company. This company is called Poolside. This company raised 126 million euros even before it was actually incorporated. And this company was incorporated in France. So the founder of GitHub, who was between the US and Canada, decided to come to France to launch his generative AI company with enormous ambitions, of course, given the breadth of GitHub. So what we really want to achieve is to have leaders in, of course, not only in the field of LLM developers, and we have at least, if I include Poolside, we now have at least 3 or 4 companies that are direct rivals to OpenAI. I should also mention that when Sam Altman was in Paris, he tried to, let me not say discourage, but he tried to hire those French guys that were setting their own generative AI business for wages that I'm ashamed to share with you. So there is this that's happening, but it's not only this. Then generative AI, it's those that develop the models, but then those that do the inference, those that provide the computing power, and so on and so forth. And we need to have an ecosystem where we are free, we are independent. We not that every piece of every GPU is built in Europe, no. But that we own we own the technology, we own large language models, we have our own, or we have French or European-based large language models. It's very important for a variety of reasons, for sovereignty, for independence, that's what I was saying, but also because since these models are going to play an important role in many dimensions of our lives, for companies, for administrations, and so on, it's unthinkable to have or to implement models that would be trained on the Anglo-Saxon cultural patrimony and language. We need models that are trained based on the French heritage, both in terms of language and culture.
I think there's another question here. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. I have a question about digital inclusion. Faced with the increasing digitalization of administrative services as well as private ones, what is France and Europe's strategy to ensure that those furthest from the digital world are not excluded, and that it doesn't generate even more inequalities?
So that's a very good question, and let me maybe share with you some numbers on the digital divide in France. 1/3 of French citizens are, how can I translate that in English, éloignés du numérique. So let's say that half of the French citizens are digitally unable or digitally impaired, either because they are not connected to the internet, either because they don't feel competent in using This is, and all the numbers I'm going to share are based on a very detailed report that was published by the CREDOC, that I asked to the CREDOC, and I was published earlier this year. And that I confirm myself, because as a colleague of Philippe Martin, I like to run regressions myself. So I obtained some data and on another sample, and I confirmed the results I'm going to share with you. So 30% of people are digitally impaired. This is not a generational fact. There are digitally impaired people at every age of the life cycle, whatever. This is a social fact, because blue collars are overrepresented among the digitally impaired, as well as those with low levels of education, as well as those with more modest income, as well as those that live in small rural areas rather than the Parisian hypercenter. Most importantly, and pay attention to what I'm going to say, because I'm happy to hear students at Sciences Po care about digital divide, but you should care about digital divide. Because those 30% or this third of French citizens that are digitally impaired do not vote any longer. The abstention rate or the abstention rate of the digitally impaired is much higher than the abstention rate of those that are digitally competent. So it's not a generational fact. It's not that all people don't know how to go on the internet. It's something that is converging with social divide, and that requires an answer. So far, I think we've done more harm than good. I think that when we've digitalized public services, we've been guilty of digging the digital divide further. And we have no excuse, because in other countries of the world, digital infrastructure, digitalization of public services have led to more inclusion rather than more exclusion. Take India, for instance. And if you're interested in digital democracy and digital inclusion, you should know about the Aadhaar initiative in India. India, because there was very strong political will, has created 2 and soon to be 3 sets of public infrastructure for digital identity, for payments, and the third one I don't remember. But for digital identity and for payments, those public digital infrastructure that were forced upon everyone, there was huge political will by Modi and so on. They allowed hundreds of millions of Indian citizens to access public services as well as commercial services when they were, until then, completely prevented from accessing those services because they had no ID, because they had no payment means. So what I'm saying here is that we've, as you know, the administration in France, but in all other Western G7 countries, have done a lot of harm because they had a lot of bureaucracy. It was already very complicated to pay or to do stuff, to do what you have to do with the administration with a pen and paper. But then the only thing we've done is to digitalize bureaucracy. And this has become even more difficult for a number of our citizens. And we need to correct that. So the first thing we've done was 2021, during the stimulus plan in France, where we decided to hire 4,000 digital counselors that were paid by the government and that were sent with municipalities, with associations, with agricultural chambers and so on, to help people deal with digital skills. And that's good. And now we're sort of furthering this initiative by setting up a local governance of the digital inclusion policy, so that in every area in the country there is one person, there is not one person, but one institution that leads this digital inclusion policy and coordinates the efforts that many people today are doing to fight against digital divide. So that's good. But then, it will not be enough. And I have great hopes that the generative AI revolution can help us sort of catch up on what we've not succeeded in doing with the digitalization of public services. My vision, even though it's not up to my ministry to achieve that, my vision is that in some years from now, when we have our own models that are robust and so on, when we have put the regulation and so on, anyone can be able to access their rights and public services with the simple instrument that everyone knows how to play, your language. This will require political will, because we'll have to streamline the bureaucracy in order for people to communicate and to access their rights only with their language. But I think we can catch up on India, on Ukraine, on Estonia, that are much ahead of us in terms of bridging the digital divide with technology.
Thank you very much. I think we have to stop here. I'm afraid, because some people are waiting for the room. So it was a pleasure. I'm sure there are many other...
No, I cannot let you go. Before I answer your second question, I think, which was, or maybe one previous question, which is what's most important in terms of the EU agenda for the digital? And I tell all of you, and I invite you to join our efforts, which is the protection of children online. This is our big fight. This is the president's fight. This is my personal fight. In France, we have, 70 million people living in our country. There are 2 million children that are exposed each month to pornographic content. At 12 years old, half of young boys are exposed each month in my country, in our country, to pornographic content with enormous consequences on their health, on their affective development, and so on. So we're taking legislation. I'm actually going to go to Parliament next week. It's going to be an intense fight. But even if I pass the legislation in France, I will be fought against by the majors of the pornographic industry. And so at the same time that I'm passing legislation in France, I'm trying to convince my colleagues from other EU member states to follow my lead, so that when the pornographic giants go to the European courts to fight against those new rules that we want to impose on them, that France is not alone, but that as many countries as possible in Europe join forces with us. So if you're from other EU member states, please tell your government to join forces with me.
Thank you very much. I feel really sorry because I'm sure that many of you had questions in their head, but we have to leave the room now. Thank you again, Mr. Minister. It was a great interaction.